A boy was lowered into a hole in the ground with a rope tied around his legs. Above him, a team of archaeologists watched the rope go slack, then tighten, then stop moving altogether. He was stuck, wedged inside a passage barely wider than a dinner plate, 100 feet beneath one of the most visited places on Earth. They pulled him out by his ankles. Nobody has gone back in since. The passage is still down there right now, pointing straight toward the Great Pyramid, and to this day, nobody knows where it actually leads. This isn't the inside of the Great Pyramid itself. It's something else entirely, a structure hidden directly beneath the causeway that connects the Sphinx to the Pyramid of Khafre, the second largest of the three pyramids at Giza. Millions of tourists have walked over this spot without knowing it existed. There's no dramatic entrance, no carved doorway, just a narrow opening in the rock that leads straight down into darkness. Archaeologists call it the Osiris shaft, and the story of how it was found, lost, found again, and finally understood spans 2,500 years. To understand why this discovery matters, it helps to understand what Giza actually was to the people who built it. The pyramids of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure weren't isolated monuments standing alone in the desert. Each one was the centerpiece of a much larger funerary complex, made up of temples, causeways, boat pits, and satellite structures, all designed to guide a dead pharaoh through the transition from earthly ruler to divine, being in the afterlife. The causeway connecting the Sphinx to Khafre's pyramid was itself a processional route, likely used to move the pharaoh's body and funerary equipment from a valley temple near the Nile up to the pyramid during burial rites. It's a functional piece of ancient infrastructure, not just a decorative pathway. That's part of why the presence of a hidden structure directly beneath it is significant. It sits inside the ceremonial heart of the entire complex, not off to the side. The story of how this particular structure came to light actually begins over 2,000 years before Zahi Hawass ever set foot near Giza, with a Greek traveler named Herodotus, writing around 450 BCE. Herodotus toured Egypt during the late period and recorded what local priests and guides told him, mixing genuine historical detail with legend and second-hand rumor in roughly equal measure. He's often called the father of history for being one of the first writers to systematically document the customs, geography, and stories of foreign lands, but he's also been criticized for centuries for repeating claims he couldn't verify, presenting local folklore alongside first-hand observation without always distinguishing the two. Among his accounts of Egypt, he described an underground chamber near the pyramids, said to be surrounded by water, connected to the Nile through hidden channels, and containing a burial. For most of the next 2,000 years, this claim was treated as one of Herodotus's less reliable stories. There was no structure like that known to exist at Giza, no physical evidence to back it up, and it seemed like exactly the kind of dramatic flourish Herodotus was known for. Egyptologists studying Giza in the 18th and 19th centuries found nothing to support it, and the account was largely set aside as travelers' folklore rather than a genuine record of a real place. Then, in the 20th century, part of that story turned out to be true. An Egyptian archaeologist named Salim Hassan, working at Giza in the 1930s, discovered a vertical shaft cut into the bedrock near the causeway. He descended as far as he could, but hit water before he could go any deeper. Without modern pumping equipment, there was nothing more he could do. He documented what he'd found, sealed the site, and moved on. For the next several decades, the shaft was known to exist, but essentially forgotten, a footnote in excavation reports, unreachable and unexplored. The groundwater at Giza remained too high to attempt a full excavation. That changed by the late 1990s. Decades of regional water management along the Nile, including changes tied to the construction of the Aswan High Dam earlier in the 20th century, had gradually altered groundwater levels across the Nile Valley, and at Giza, specifically, the water table beneath the plateau had dropped enough to make excavation feasible again for the first time since Hassan's initial attempt. In 1999, Zahi Hawass, then the leading figure in Egyptian antiquities, and one of the most recognizable archaeologists in the world, led a team back down into the same shaft Hassan had abandoned 66 years earlier. This time, they came equipped with modern water pumps capable of clearing the flooded lower levels. What followed was, by Hawass's own account, one of the most physically demanding excavations of his career. The shaft was narrow, unstable, and saturated with thick mud that had to be cleared largely by hand, in cramped, poorly ventilated conditions, nearly 100 feet below ground. Workers had to be lowered and raised repeatedly, hauling out debris bucket by bucket, while pumps struggled to keep the lowest chamber from refilling, with groundwater seeping in through the surrounding limestone. Weeks of continuous pumping and digging were required just to expose the lower levels, enough to examine them safely. But what the team eventually found matched in broad strokes the description Herodotus had given more than 2,000 years earlier. A structure below ground, water surrounding it on all sides. A stone chamber built in some form to hold the dead. The shaft descends through 3 distinct levels, and each one tells a different part of the story. The first level is almost anticlimactic. It's a simple, roughly square chamber cut into the limestone, empty apart from debris. If the excavation had stopped there, it would have been a minor curiosity, a hole with nothing inside it, but it was only the entrance to what lay beneath. The second level, roughly 60 feet down, opens into a set of 6 carved chambers arranged around a central space. 2 of these chambers contain large stone sarcophagi, and the surrounding rooms held fragments of pottery, beads, and small funerary figures known as shabtis, which ancient Egyptians placed in tombs to serve as symbolic laborers for the deceased, meant to perform any manual labor the soul might be called upon to do in the afterlife, rather than the deceased having to do it themselves. The presence of shabtis is itself a useful dating tool for archaeologists, since their style, material, and inscriptions changed noticeably across different periods of Egyptian history. Based on the style of the objects recovered here, archaeologists date this level to around the 5th century BCE, placing it in Egypt's late period, roughly 2,000 years after the pyramids themselves were built. This tells us something important about the site as a whole. Whatever this place was originally built for, back in the Old Kingdom, people were still returning to it, reusing it and adapting it for their own burials well over 2,000 years later, treating it as a location worth reoccupying rather than abandoning. The third level is where the shaft becomes genuinely strange, and where its connection to Herodotus' ancient account becomes hard to dismiss as coincidence. Nearly 100 feet below the surface, roughly the depth of a 10-story building, the shaft opens into a large hall that floods with groundwater seeping in from the surrounding bedrock. At the center of this flooded chamber sits a rectangular stone platform, surrounded on all sides by water like a small artificial island. On top of that platform rests a massive sarcophagus carved from granite, weighing somewhere in the range of 10 to 15 tons. Granite of this quality wasn't available locally at Giza. It had to be quarried at Aswan, hundreds of miles to the south, then transported down the Nile, a logistical undertaking that by itself signals this chamber was not a minor or improvised project. Its lid had already been displaced before Hawas's team arrived, and the sarcophagus itself was empty. No mummy, no remains, no grave goods left behind to identify who, if anyone, it had once held. Whether it was looted at some point in antiquity, deliberately emptied, or simply never used to house a body in the first place remains an open question. What struck the excavation team most wasn't the size of the sarcophagus. It was the silence around it. Ancient Egyptian tombs, even modest ones, are almost always covered in inscriptions. Prayers, spells from the Book of the Dead, the name and titles of the person buried inside. Invocations to protect their soul on its journey through the underworld. This chamber had none of that. No hieroglyphs on the walls, no name on the sarcophagus, nothing to explain who this space was built for or why. In a civilization that used writing to fill every available surface of a burial with religious protection, and this deliberate blankness stood out as unusual, almost as if the builders intended for this place to remain unlabeled. There was, however, one exception. According to Hawas's account of the excavation, when the lid of the sarcophagus was examined, a single hieroglyphic symbol was found carved nearby, the sign for pur, meaning house. On its own, that word means very little, but the ancient Egyptian name for the entire Giza Plateau, going back to the Old Kingdom, was Rostau, a term closely tied to the underworld and to Osiris, the god who ruled over the realm of the dead. Combined, the inscription pointed to something like the House of Osiris, Lord of Rostau. If that reading is correct, this wasn't simply a tomb. It was constructed, at least symbolically, as a gateway to the underworld itself, a physical representation of Osiris's domain built directly beneath the most sacred ground in Egypt. That single detail is why Hawas named the site the Osiris Shaft. It tied together the ancient name of the plateau, the mythology of Osiris as ruler of the dead, and, at least in a general sense, the description Herodotus had recorded so long before anyone had proof it was real. Hawas has referred to it as one of the most meaningful discoveries of his career, not because of its treasure, since there was none, but because of what it seemed to represent about how the ancient Egyptians understood this landscape. Beyond the burial chamber, the third level holds one more feature that has never been fully explained. A narrow passage extends east from the flooded hall, leading to a small vault barely large enough for a person to turn around in. From that vault, 2 more tunnels branch off in different directions. One points north, roughly toward the Great Pyramid. The other points east, roughly toward the Sphinx. Both are only about 16 inches square, far too small for an adult to enter. This is where the attempted exploration comes in. According to Hawas's own descriptions of the dig, in an effort to see where these tunnels led, the team lowered a small boy into one of them with a rope tied around his legs, since no adult could physically fit through an opening only 16 inches across. He made it only a short distance before becoming stuck in the narrow passage, and the team had to pull him back. Out by pulling on the rope. No further attempt to explore those tunnels has been documented since, and modern archaeological ethics would make repeating that kind of approach with a child extremely unlikely today. Their length, destination, and purpose remain unknown. Whether they lead to another chamber, connect to a larger network beneath the plateau, or simply end after a few meters of solid rock, nobody currently knows, because nobody has been able to get far enough inside to find out. Modern archaeology does have tools that could theoretically answer this question without ever sending a person inside. Small remote-operated cameras and narrow robotic probes have already been used successfully elsewhere in Egypt, most notably inside the so-called air shafts of the Great Pyramid itself, where a tiny robot equipped with a camera was sent through a narrow internal passage in the early 2000s and again in more recent years, eventually revealing a small stone door with copper handles that remains unexplained. No comparable robotic exploration of the Osiris shaft's 2 narrow tunnels has been publicly documented, which means that, as of now, this remains one of the very few identified but physically unreachable spaces left at Giza. In an archaeological landscape that has been surveyed, scanned, and mapped as extensively as Giza has, that alone makes it unusual. Dating the Osiris shaft as a whole is complicated precisely because it wasn't built and used once. The oldest material recovered from the site, based on artifact analysis, points to Egypt's Old Kingdom, the same era that produced the pyramids themselves, somewhere around the 24th to 22nd century BCE. That raises the possibility that the shaft's lowest level, or at least the concept behind it, is genuinely as old as the pyramids above it. But the 6 chambers on the second level, along with their sarcophagi and shabti figures, appear to have been added roughly 2,000 years later, during Egypt's late period. In other words, this wasn't a single tomb built and sealed. It was a site that different generations of Egyptians, across a span of more than 2 millennia, kept returning to, reusing, and reinterpreting, all drawn to the same underground location beneath Giza. That long, layered history is part of why archaeologists still don't agree on exactly what the Osiris shaft was for. One interpretation is that it functioned, at least at some point, as an actual royal or elite burial site, later repurposed by other officials for their own interments, as older tombs were sometimes reused across Egyptian history when new construction was costly or politically inconvenient. Another view holds that the flooded third level in particular was never meant to hold an actual human burial at all, and instead served a purely symbolic or ritual function, a physical stand-in for the mythological underworld, built so that priests or pilgrims could enact rites connected to Osiris without an actual body ever being present. This kind of symbolic tomb, sometimes called a cenotaph, wasn't unheard of in ancient Egypt. Several pharaohs commissioned empty ceremonial tombs at sites separate from their actual burial place, intended purely for religious purposes rather than physical interment. So the idea that the deepest level of the Osiris shaft could have served a similar symbolic role isn't inconsistent with known Egyptian practice. A third possibility, still unconfirmed, is that the unexplored tunnels connect to a broader network of passages beneath the Giza Plateau that hasn't been mapped or excavated. This idea has gained attention in recent years alongside separate radar and remote sensing surveys of the plateau, though those studies remain preliminary, unverified through direct excavation, and are treated with considerable skepticism by much of the archaeological community, since ground-penetrating techniques at this scale can be difficult to interpret accurately and are prone to producing ambiguous or exaggerated results. What can be stated with confidence is only what has actually been excavated and physically documented. The 3 levels, the sarcophagi, the single inscription, and the 2 unexplored tunnels. Everything beyond that is, for now, informed speculation rather than established fact, and any responsible account of the site has to keep that distinction clear. For most of its existence, the Osiris shaft sat completely inaccessible to the public, first because nobody knew its lower levels existed, then because it was flooded and physically unreachable, and finally because it remained a working excavation site for years, even after Hawas's team completed their initial survey in 1999. It wasn't until 2017 that the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities officially opened the shaft to visitors for the first time, allowing people to descend into a structure that had been sealed off from human eyes for the vast majority of its recorded history. Even now, access is limited and carefully managed, and much of what lies beyond the second level remains difficult and genuinely dangerous to reach, particularly the flooded third chamber and the narrow tunnels branching off from it, which are not part of the standard visitor route. For Hawas himself, who went on to serve multiple terms as Egypt's Minister of State for Antiquities Affairs and became arguably the most publicly recognized Egyptologist of his generation, the Osiris shaft has remained a personal touchstone throughout his career. He has repeatedly singled it out in interviews and public talks as among the most meaningful discoveries of his working life, not because of any monetary value attached to the find, since nothing of the kind was recovered, but specifically because of what it seemed to confirm about a 2,000-year-old written account that virtually the entire academic world had dismissed. In a field where reputations are often built on spectacular finds involving gold or intact royal burials, the significance of the Osiris shaft lies almost entirely in what it demonstrates about the reliability, however partial, of ancient testimony. What makes the Osiris shaft such a compelling case isn't spectacle. There's no gold, no mummy, no dramatic curse. What makes it remarkable is how it forces a reconsideration of a source that had been dismissed for over 2,000 years. Herodotus wrote about a hidden, water-surrounded burial chamber near the pyramids at a time when no physical evidence supported his claim, and generations of historians treated that account as an embellishment, a piece of local color rather than fact. It took modern pumping equipment, a falling water table, and a persistent excavation team willing to work through mud and darkness 100 feet underground to prove that at least part of what he described was real. That doesn't mean every detail Herodotus recorded should now be taken at face value. He remains as ever a source that mixed observation with hearsay. But it's a rare and striking example of an ancient writer's account being partially vindicated by direct archaeological excavation, thousands of years after the fact. The unresolved parts of the story are just as important as the confirmed ones. Nobody has walked to the end of either of those 16-inch tunnels. Nobody knows whether they run for a few feet before hitting solid rock or extend much farther beneath the plateau. Nobody can say with certainty whether the flooded chamber and its empty sarcophagus once held an actual burial that was removed, or whether it was symbolic from the start, built to represent Osiris's underworld rather than to house a body. And nobody can fully explain why, in a civilization that inscribed nearly every tomb surface with prayers and names, this particular chamber was left almost entirely blank, except for a single word carved beneath the sarcophagus lid. The Osiris shaft sits directly beneath one of the most heavily documented, most intensely studied archaeological sites on the planet. Giza has been excavated, mapped, surveyed, and photographed for well over 2 centuries, visited by more archaeologists, tourists, and researchers than almost anywhere else in the ancient world. And yet a structure connecting 3 separate levels, holding hundreds of ancient objects, spanning 2,000 years of use, along with a pair of unexplored tunnels aimed directly at its 2 most famous monuments, sat hidden and half-forgotten under the feet of tourists for most of the 20th century. It was rediscovered almost by accident, not through some new scanning technology or breakthrough excavation technique, but simply because the water level dropped low enough, decades after it was first identified, to let anyone back inside. It stands as a reminder that even the most famous, most photographed places on Earth can still be holding onto secrets that simply haven't dropped low enough, or dried out enough, or been looked at closely enough for anyone to properly find. It's also worth remembering how narrow the margin was between this discovery happening and not happening at all. Selim Hassan found the entrance in 1933 and was stopped by nothing more complicated than water he had no way to remove. Had the regional water table not shifted over the following decades, the shaft might still be sitting there today, sealed, flooded, and unexamined, its lower levels nothing more than a line in an old excavation report. It took a specific combination of factors, environmental change, available pumping technology, and a team willing to spend weeks working in mud 100 feet underground for the connection to Herodotus' ancient account to ever be confirmed at all. Whatever the tunnels beneath the Osiris shaft eventually turn out to lead to, whether it's more chambers, a dead end after only a few feet, or a genuine extension of the passage network beneath the plateau, the shaft itself has already accomplished something rare in archaeology. It took a claim that had been quietly dismissed as folklore for 2,500 years, and turned it, at least in part, into physically documented, excavated fact. Somewhere beneath the sand at Giza, directly under the causeway that millions of visitors walk across every year without a second thought, 2 narrow passages barely wide enough for a dinner plate are still pointing toward the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx, sealed off, unexplored, and waiting for someone or something small enough to finally find out where they go. If a story like this is the kind of thing that keeps you up at night wondering what else is still buried under our feet, you're exactly who this channel is made for. Every week, we dig into cases like this one, discoveries that were dismissed for centuries before turning out to be real, structures that sat hidden in plain sight, and mysteries that professional archaeologists still can't fully explain, even with modern equipment. If you want to be there the moment the next one drops, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications. Because some of these stories move fast once new research comes out, and you don't want to be the last one to know. And before you go, I want to hear from you. Do you think the 2 unexplored tunnels beneath the Osiris shaft actually lead somewhere significant? Or do you think they simply dead end a few feet in, the way plenty of ancient shafts eventually do once you get past the mythology? Drop your theory in the comments below. I read through them, and Some of the most interesting angles on these videos have come directly from viewers who noticed a detail I didn't even mention. If you've been to Giza yourself, or if you've seen the Osiris shaft in person since it opened to the public in 2017, I'd genuinely love to hear what it was actually like standing down there, because photos and video only tell you so much about what it feels like to be 100 feet underground next to an empty granite sarcophagus. If this video actually taught you something new, A-like goes a long way. It's the simplest way to tell the algorithm that this kind of deep, source-based history deserves to be shown to more people instead of getting buried under recycled clickbait. And if you know someone who's obsessed with ancient Egypt, ancient mysteries, or just unsolved archaeological puzzles in general, send this one their way. Chances are they haven't heard of the Osiris shaft, and this is exactly the kind of story that's more fun to talk about with someone else once you've both seen it. We're going to keep digging into places like this, sites that sat right under everyone's nose for decades before anyone had the tools or the timing to actually get inside. If that sounds like your kind of channel, this is your sign to subscribe, because the next one might be even stranger than this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.